Danny, let me start out by asking you, you started writing for Rolling Stone. I did a little research. You were 18 years old. Tell us a little bit about those times and what did you write about during that period?
Well, I started, my first job was actually with Billboard, which was a trade magazine in the music business. And initially it was a clerical job to help them compile the charts. This was the late 60s. There were no barcodes or computers or
Mhm.
digitization of any kind. So a bunch of us would sit in the room and physically call record stores and ask what was selling and have a checklist. And then I realized there were people on the other side of the office that were getting paid to write their opinions about records and concerts, and they got in for free and got free records. And I thought this sounds like something I could do. I was not a very good high school student, and but I knew I could write my opinions about that. So I just kept nagging them. And what happened is they had staff writers, but there were so many things happening in New York City that I would be able to cover the ones as a stringer, on a freelance basis that none of the staff people wanted. And the high point of that era came with the Woodstock Festival, because none of the staff writers wanted to go to Woodstock. By that time, I was 19, and because these were older guys, they were all guys who wanted to go to places where you could get free drinks, like covering Smokey Robinson Miracles of the Copacabana or things like that. They didn't want to go and be in a big field somewhere. And I was of the hippie generation that was excited to go. So that's how it started. I just kind of, in those days, I think in every era there's disadvantages to being young and there's advantages. Young people today know how to work this digital stuff better than we do, but
Way better.
they don't always have the connections. At that time, there were older people who understood everything about how the business worked, but they didn't understand the music. So that's how I got initially by being in the generation that understood what was then the popular music.
You were a kind of music fanatic from an early age, as was I. What was it that drove you or made you come to music?
I just don't really even know how I could articulate it. It just certain music just gets into your head. It used to make me feel less alone, and it would be a mysterious process. Because, for example, Woody Guthrie had a song called "Hard Traveling." So I'm like 13 or 14 years old, and I'm listening. I've been doing some hard traveling. I'm thinking, yeah, I've been doing some hard traveling too. My hard traveling was arguing with my social studies teacher because they didn't like my essay. But I had a perfectly comfortable, middle class life. But the emotions of being a teenager made everything seem like hard traveling. So that's the mysterious. I think that a lot happened like that when my son was growing up, who's now in his 27, and how he could relate to hip hop, because it wasn't like the lyrics were about a life that was anything like his external life,
Mm.
but the inner feeling of desperation, of anger, of frustration, of aspiration spoke to the teenage minds, not just of African Americans in the ghetto, but to a massive white middle class audience, because it tapped into an emotion. So there's something about music that's able to touch an emotional chord that makes people feel less alone. That if other people are liking Bob Dylan and he's singing about Desolation Row, then I'm not the only freak who feels that sometimes life seems like a desolation row. And it's just one of those mysterious things. Nobody really knows why, but there's been studies of Alzheimer's patients who are they're just not communicating at all, and then they
Mhm.
put headphones on, they play them something from Duke Ellington, or when they were growing up, whatever the music was, and they suddenly come to life and start laughing. So there's something about music and the way it interrelates with the brain and the emotions that's different from any other kind of communication.
No, I understand very clearly what you're saying because when I was in my late teens, I fell in love with three different albums. Van Morrison's Astro Weeks album,
Oh, one of my favorites.
yeah, and Charles Lloyd's Forest Flower,
Also
and
one of my favorites.
Miles Davis's In a Silent Way. I went to NYU and I used to sit in their music listening room and listen to Miles Davis all day. So I understand exactly where you're coming from. Let me ask you this. You work with a wide variety of artists, everybody from Led Zeppelin, Ricky Lee Jones, uh, Bonnie Raitt, Nirvana. What was there a common thread that ran through them, not just musically, but in terms of their temperament, in terms of their mindset?
Well, there's kind of a two-part answer to that. First of all, one common thing is that they all wanted to work with me because there's a lot of people that I think are great who I never was able to connect with for one reason or another. But it seems like the people that I've been destined to work with over the decades have been artists that were very individualistic, who were what maybe in the movie world people would call auteurs, who wrote a lot of their own material, who certainly made all of their own decisions, who knew who they were. So I was never somebody who told someone how to dress or how to look or what an album cover should look like. It was always these were fierce-minded, creative people. Some of them I consider geniuses who needed help in the business area, in the marketing area, and as a sounding board. So in that sense, I've always been more attracted to, and think I can kind of better serve those kind of very strong-minded, individualistic artists as opposed to people that are sort of singers where you've got to create a whole thing around them. I don't have the talent to figure out who should write a song or who should do the arrangement, but I do have a sensitivity to some of these very intense characters who produce some of the kind of music that I've worked with.
Let me shift gears just a little bit and ask you what shaped your progressive consciousness?
I think my parents certainly, my political views are very similar to what my parents were when I was growing up and what I think they would be if they were still alive. Um, they were certainly, I was born in 1950, so growing up in the 60s, the civil rights movement was a thing that our family was very supportive of, and my parents, were, gave donations to the NAACP and CORE and whatever else there was. When the war in Vietnam started, my dad, who had served in World War II and was part of the D-Day invasion, was very sympathetic to the anti-war argument. He didn't want his kids having to go to a war that he couldn't justify. So a lot of it was that I grew up in an environment, and in those days, the word liberal was not a dirty word, and that today we would call it progressive because liberal became debased in part by the Vietnam War, and and that was really it. And then at the same time, there were artists as I got older that seemed to be expressing what I was feeling about those issues in my vernacular, particularly a singer-songwriter named Phil Oakes,
Oh, sure.
was a big game changer for me. He had a song, I Ain't a Marching Anymore, and another song called Love Me, I'm a Liberal, which kind of ridiculed insincere liberals. And people like Buffy St. Marie with Universal Soldier and later Marvin Gaye with What's Going On. And there were movies like Dr. Strangelove and 7 Days in May that spoke about these things. And there were things in the theater, Blues for Mr. Charlie, or I'm just trying to think of. So to me, as a 60s kid, culture, art, uh, music, movies, and politics, and actually spirituality, and to be honest with you, psychedelics, were
Mhm.
all part of one cultural light that I was attracted to.
I totally understand. I'm only a year younger than you, and a lot of what shaped you also shaped me. I also was very, very fortunate in that I had an older brother who was a jazz fanatic.
Right.
And during a time I listened to almost nothing but R&B, and then I had started moving into listening to rock. I went to his house one day. He demanded that I sit down in the couch and listen to jazz. So I
Mm.
listened to Charlie Parker, I listened to Dizzy Gillespie and all these different people who I had heard before, but I really didn't understand.
Right. Right.
And once you begin to understand it, like, wait a minute, you mean there was nothing that was done like this before them? And
Right.
suddenly,
Right.
it's really very much like an epiphany. And it was, some of the best times in my life. I still listen to Ballerina and Madame George from the Astro Weeks album. And
Me
it's been
too.
like a half century already.
Me too. Well, there's something about the effect music has on you when you're in your teens that's different from any other time in your life. I
True.
think there are probably psychologists that could know the fancy words for it, imprinting or whatever like that. But there's no question that there's songs I can listen to and I remember what I was eating the first time I heard the song.
Yeah,
You know, I
absolutely.
remember who else was in the room the first time I heard, Rubber Soul, you
Hmm.
know, and that's just not the case for me for music I heard in my 30s and 40s. I loved some music then. I love music now, but it comes from a little more of a different analytical place, and not it doesn't just go right into the emotional world the way music did when I was a teenager.
No, it changes over time. I one of my most vivid memories was being away at school and having a guy run up to me and said, "Riley, you got to listen to this. Riley, you got to listen to this." And it was the "Are You Experienced" album, and I had never heard music quite like that
I
before in
remember
my
the
life.
first time I heard that. That was
Yeah,
like unbelievable. That was
unbelievable. Yeah.
mind blowing. Yeah.
Let me
And
ask
I
you this.
still
Mhm.
hear songs from that record, Purple Haze, or
Hey,
like
Joe.
it gets to me in a different way. And it's funny because being in the business, as I got older, I'd meet people of my age and they'd say, "Oh, the music today is not as good as it was when we were young." And I said, "No, no, no, we're just not as young as we used to
We
be when
used to
we were
be.
young. You go
Absolutely.
up to a 15-year-old, it's just as good. We're just not 15 anymore."
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Danny Goldberg, you have a very unique view of the entertainment business. And I'm wondering, how does the music entertainment business rebound or recover from COVID?
Oh man, I don't know exactly how, except that through the ages, artists make art. I think one of my clients, Steve Earle,
Oh, yeah, wonderful guy, wonderful
who
guy.
I know you got to know, and during our brief period working professionally together, and who I still work with after 21 years, and years ago he said to me, artists do what they need to do to make art. He says it's not that Michelangelo loved the Pope's politics; he needed a ceiling to paint.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I think that somehow it will find a way. Obviously, it's been an incredible hardship on many, many artists who made their living, paid their bills from live music,
Yeah,
and that's the cohort we're talking about, because the value of recordings and copyrights has not been damaged by COVID, because people are streaming more,
yeah,
and
yeah.
that's the source of revenue. But for live performers and the musicians that play live and the road crew and those people, I mean, they've just been completely locked out, for a year, and it's coming up on a year, and it's probably going to be at least another 6 months. And I don't. Everybody is hanging on for dear life in their own way, borrowing money, getting other jobs, lowering their costs in some way. It's a heartbreaking thing, but I think there's still a demand for live music. We don't know how fast it's going to come back, because firstly you've got to get over the legal obstacles of
Sure.
municipalities allowing a certain sized audience in a certain place, and they're going to start with one-fourth capacity and then maybe go up to one-half capacity. Obviously, during the warm weather, it's gonna be more doable, because outdoor is less likely for people to get infections. And then as the vaccine gets more widely, more people have gotten vaccines. That issue will subside, but then there's going to be the issue of some older members of the audience who are just going to still be scared, and people who just can't afford the tickets because of the incredible
It's going
effect
to be expensive.
that
Yeah.
COVID and the pandemic has had on the economy. So I think it's going to come back slowly, but it's going to come back in stages, starting with this summer, and
Mhm.
by the summer of next year, I think it's going to be kind of normal, except for the toll that the economic damage has taken on the society, and that people will. But I do think that although there's been this phenomenon of streaming of music, and people
Mhm.
do like that experience because it's better than nothing, it's not the same as being in a crowd, especially if you're single. Can't take a date to a computer screen.
Yeah,
But
true.
also, there's beyond the dating aspect, there's a certain mystery to the feeling of being in a group of people experiencing music together, or theater,
Mhm.
that I think will remain part of the culture despite all this digital stuff. But how it'll play out economically is anybody's guess. We're just the people I know. We're just kind of one day at a time, one week at a time.
Final quick question. I've read and heard from musicians who were very, very upset. You mentioned streaming, and they seem to be of a mind that they're not getting the revenue that they feel they deserve. Do they have
Yeah.
a point?
Well, there's certainly a point to it, and it didn't just start with streaming. I mean, this started with the so-called file sharing back around 2001 is when the old business started to collapse. The old business was based, in the latter stages on compact discs. Before that, it was different
Mhm.
formats, cassettes or albums. And as digitization became the thing and people could get music for free on the internet, or there were sites that are driven by advertising. The overall value of recording started to go down. So that was a trend that started before streaming.
Mhm.
The irritating thing to a lot of people about streaming is that it has definitely saved the major record companies because they get these gigantic advances from companies like Spotify and Apple,
Mhm.
and that it's fine if you're in that rarefied upper 1% of Drake or Taylor Swift or people that have gigantic pop hits. But for the middle class artists, the revenue is micro payments that don't equate to what the royalty stream would have been 20 years ago from selling albums. There is another side to it, depending on who the songwriter and the artist is, because these micropayments go on decades into the future. The value of owning copyrights or owning masters has actually increased,
Oh,
especially in
wow.
the last few years, as the Wall Street types have decided that streaming is here to stay, and because of other weird factors like low interest rates that I don't really understand. So there are some people you read about, Neil Young or Bob Dylan or Stevie Nicks or other people, getting gigantic sums of money by selling their catalogs, and those valuations are higher for the people that have been able to retain ownership. But it's not good. There's certain artists are really at a disadvantage, certain writers are at a disadvantage, and there's just not much that can be done about it, except trying to find for certain artists new models. There are some artists that are on sites like this site, Patreon, where they do a personal
Mhm.
subscription service to their fans.
Yeah.
And for some artists, that's a good replacement of that income. If they have a passionate audience of a few thousand people that'll pay $5 a month, $10 a month. So it's a time of transition, and there are people getting hurt, as there always are in transitions. It's all being driven by big tech and big finance, and not by people that come out of the culture or the music business. But what else is new? We used to be very dependent on radio stations, and
Yeah.
radio stations sometimes had the same agenda as artists and sometimes different, because radio stations were in business to sell advertising. They had to play songs that the research people told them got the good ratings, and that eliminated certain music from the airwaves. And they were concerned. They used to The people at the radio programmers I used to know that did music would always talk about, well, we have to do research for the passive audience,
Yeah.
the large group of people who are listening to the radio that may not be passionate about it, but we don't want them to be irritated and turn the channel. And those of us in the business who work with artists, we didn't care anything about the passive audience. We cared about the active audience, that minority of super fans that'll buy tickets, that'll buy records. But that's not what the radio stations were in business to do. So then you go back to Mozart's time, and he had to please some archduke of something or other, Prince so and so.
Yeah.
And if that guy didn't like, yeah, that Amadeus is one of my favorite movies about that phenomenon of
Yeah.
Mozart had to like suck up to this royal dude in order to make a living.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
it's always a struggle being an artist. I'm not a defender of the status quo. I'm a recognizer of it. This is what we got to deal with.
Final quick question. Final quick question. Because you talked about transitions. What do you think of the transition from Donald Trump to Joe Biden? As a progressive, do you believe that Joe Biden's agenda is in fact progressive?
Well, I think you made a key point, which is it's compared to what? I mean, compared to Donald Trump, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Compared to George W. Bush, yes. Compared to Bernie Sanders, no. but Bernie Sanders lost. You know, I do believe in democracy. I think that the Democratic primaries were more or less democratic, most and that it was a substantial more people wanted Joe Biden. So I do feel that Biden has better relationship with sort of the Bernie Sanders wing than Obama did. I think he
Yeah.
recognizes that there has to be a left center coalition to beat the dark forces of the right, and that it feels a little bit better to me, the kind of people he's hiring, than it did with Clinton or Obama. But it's not going to be my socialist dream, because there's not a governing consensus in America that agrees with everything I believe in. But I do think it's a huge improvement, and that the underlying crisis of COVID is creating a widespread demand for more government after decades of people believing Ronald Reagan's lie that the worst thing is the federal government. People in
Hmm.
Texas right now who are freezing to death, they're wishing the federal government was more engaged, you know,
Absolutely.
even if they voted for Republicans their whole life. So I think there's a real chance that this could be an improvement. They've got to fix voting rights. They've got to fix democracy so that at least we can have something more democratic. We don't actually have a democracy in America, but a more democratic republic. And whatever, man. My first choice in the last election was Elizabeth Warren. My second choice was Bernie. Biden wasn't in my top five, but I have to say I'm quite pleased with the campaign he ran, the way he did reach out to the left in a respectable way. I felt picking Harris for vice president was the right thing to do. And some of the people he's hired are impressive, and some of the people he's hired are people I wish he hadn't hired. But
Yeah.
that's what happens when you live in a country with a lot of different kinds of people.